This is a story about how a particular international vision of a sustainable fishery came to being, and how this vision criminalizes the knowledge, skills, and practices of Ugandan men and women who actually work with fish there. This is also a story about the importance of perspective, about the importance of shifting our perspective from simply seeing things from above to seeing them from within. If we saw this alligator only from above, we might miss the fact that this mother alligator is taking her baby on a nice swim through the swamp. In fact, if we only saw her from above, we might fail to see that there's a baby on her head at all. Before we continue, I have to issue a warning. The women you are about to see are criminals. These women, myself included for a time, and thousands of other Ugandan women are considered criminals because they work to provide one of the most delicious, nutritious, and in-demand sources of protein in Uganda. That is smoked Nile perch. Experts deem their work as unsustainable, indeed criminal, because they're working with sizes of fish that cannot be exported. Indeed, they might not even be able to reproduce. But for these women, these fish provide crucial sources of income, in addition to crucial sources of protein. They bring cash to pay their rent, to feed, clothe, and send their children to school, and also to meet their future aspirations, helping these women to buy land, livestock, and send their children to university. Lake Victoria is the largest lake in Africa. It's also the second largest lake in the world. You could fit the states of Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New Hampshire, and probably also the District of Columbia inside this lake. It's huge. It also is the most productive freshwater fishery in the world. Approximately 10 million Eastern Africans rely on this lake, its fish, and each other for their livelihoods. This lake has also long been a feature for international commerce, exploration, and control. It first appeared in Al-Idrisi's 1154 map of what we now know as the ancient world. However, it was unknown to American and European cartographers until 1862, when John Hanning Speke traveled to the continent in search of the source of the Nile. And here he is, standing at that source. So this lake was unknown to Western science until 1862. I first visited Uganda in 2007, and since then I've spent approximately 2 years living and working with men and women who work with fish in Uganda. When I first went there, I knew I had to step away from ideas of sustainability that I had learned in scientific journal articles, policy documents, documentary films, and news articles, and instead try to learn about this lake from the perspectives of those who actually work with fish here. I soon learned that there were two very different trade networks for this same species of fish, the Nile perch. The one I'm holding in my hand enters a legal trade, where it's industrially processed and exported outside of the continent. The fish in front of me and those behind me enter a trade that circulates locally. It's dominated by women, and it's largely illegal. The Nile perch is a big fish. It's a fish that can grow to be as big as a man. This man's only 5'4", but still, that is a really, really big fish. And it hasn't always been in the lake. It was introduced formally in 1962. That's 100 years after Speke discovered the source of the Nile in Lake Victoria, and the very same year that Uganda gained independence from colonial rule. It took a number of years for the Nile perch to establish itself in the lake, but before it did, about 80% of all fish in this incredibly productive lake are like those we see here: small, diverse, and brightly colored. These fish are easy to process and were processed, traded, fished, and consumed widely around what we now call Lake Victoria. But the Nile perch, when it was introduced, did what it continues to do today. That is, eat as many small fish as possible. So it led to the extinction of an estimated 300 of these many different species of fish, although it's hard to know exactly what happened here. But it is to say now, 2% maybe of the fish in the lake remain these small, diverse, and brightly colored fish. This is a Nile perch head and some flesh that I was preparing for my own sauce. A fisherman had given it to me, and I found one of these fish inside of it. And then I realized this keeps happening all the time, and it's still happening. These large fish are caught by fishermen who then take them to collection sites where big trucks filled with ice are waiting to take them to fish processing plants. At these plants, they are processed and formed into uniformly, generally 500-gram fillets that are then repackaged into these containers like we see here, flown outside of the continent to Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and even the United States. When they leave the country, they enter what economists call white fish markets, where they compete with tilapia, cod, different kinds of bass, catfish, and Nile perch appears there. This package we see here is from the Netherlands. Here the Nile perch is stripped of its identity. It's called Victoria Bars. It's not called Nile perch because the Nile is seen as being a dirty river. And it's not called perch either because bass is seen as a more sophisticated fish in the Netherlands than perch. But in the basin, Nile perch remains incredibly important. The same fishermen that are catching big fish are also catching small fish. And these are purchased by women who take them to their homes, where they clean them by hand, dry them in the sun briefly, smoke them in kilns that they have built themselves, and then take them to markets, like wholesale markets like this one, where women are waiting there to buy their fish, and other women are waiting to buy their fish and sell them on until they reach consumers. And money is being made at every single point of this transaction. Ugandan women start working with fish to gain a chance at the good life in Uganda. Many of them are single mothers or widows, and many don't have a lot of education. But the Nile perch provides opportunities unlike any other food commodity for women to make money. At the end of the day, in a market like this one, or at a smaller market in a town, or even fried fish that a woman might be preparing in her own house to sell to her neighbors, every single day that a woman works with fish, her fish are all sold. That will never, ever happen with beans or potatoes or sweet potatoes or cassava. The Nile perch is incredibly lucrative, but this trade is being seen as illegal and unsustainable. The processing plants that built up around the lake came in the 1990s, but women have long worked with fish here. This is Akello, who taught me how to smoke fish in 2008, and we've worked together quite a lot since then. And she's showing me pictures here of her mother smoking fish 20 years earlier. The decline in large Nile perch are seen as the sustainability crisis for Lake Victoria. There are no large fish, so the story goes, to be produced, and this is a problem. Fish processing plants are working under capacity. So we need more big fish in the lake. That's the fear. That's the sustainability challenge. So what happens? This has led to new alliances between groups like the European Union, with the support of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, which is providing funding for a program called Smart Fish, which promises to bring secure fisheries and secure futures. These next photos are from Smart Fish's own Facebook site. What do? They go to fish beaches and they burn fishing nets. They confiscate fish on their way to markets. Women that I talked to in 2012 when these operations were going on described them as violent and dehumanizing. Police, military officials, or anyone else as part of these operations would go and smash fishing boats that women owned, burn their nets, and even enter their own homes searching for fish. Women describe this as violent and dehumanizing. For those that are involved in gaining this support from Smart Fish for the basin, they view themselves as generating plans that donors can fund, that can then be implemented, because governments have a hard time implementing these kinds of plans. And for good reason. It involves doing violence to the very same constituents that they're supposed to be serving. Despite all of this, and despite the persistence and indeed maybe the sustainability of what is called the illegal trade, recent fish stock assessments have shown that fish stocks are going up. It's difficult to know exactly what's going on here, but we see that the local trade turns out to be quite sustainable in terms of persisting here, and fish stocks are rebounding. So we're left still with large perch, and things are changing. Fishermen are telling me that Nile perch have learned to avoid their nets to swim over them as they're coming. Women are telling me they're finding Nile perch of sizes that were smaller that seem to be able to reproduce now. The female fish are filled with egg sacs in sizes that they wouldn't be able to be before. And ecologists, on the other side of it, are also learning that if you want to protect a fish stock, you must first protect what they call BOFs, big, fat, old female fish. And these BOFs produce the most viable and numerous eggs. So these are the fish we ought to protect instead of perhaps exporting them, if the goal is to have sustainable populations of Nile perch. Perhaps most exciting is that fisheries biologists are also finding species of the indigenous fish in the lake, that are returning. They were thought to be extinct, but they're reemerging in nets of scientists and nets of fishermen. And with this reemergence of forms of fish that were thought to be extinct, there's emerging new ideas and new possibilities for sustainable fisheries that meet the needs of Ugandan producers and consumers first, and the needs of a global fish trade a very distant second. Thank you.